The war in Europe ended on the 7th of May, 1945. Not with a battle, not with a dramatic last stand, or a final charge, or the kind of ending that makes for clean narrative. It ended in a schoolroom in Reims, France, at 2:41 in the morning, with a German general sitting across a table from Allied officers and signing his name to a document that said it was over. The German general's name was Alfred Jodl. He was chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command. He was one of the most senior military officers in the Third Reich. He had served Adolf Hitler loyally and effectively for years. He had planned campaigns. He had signed orders. He had been present in the room for decisions that shaped the course of a war that killed somewhere between 70 and 85 million people. After he signed the surrender document, Jodl asked to speak. He was allowed to. And what he said in that early morning schoolroom in Reims was a statement that has been quoted and analyzed many times since. He said that the German people and the German armed forces had been overcome by a superior force, and that they were now delivered into the hands of the victors. He expressed, in careful diplomatic language, the hope that the victors would treat them with generosity. Then the signing was complete, the ceremony was over, the war was over, and someone suggested that Jodl be brought before Eisenhower. What happened in the next few minutes was not in any protocol. It was not planned. It was not choreographed for the cameras or scripted by a public affairs officer. It was a confrontation between two men at the end of the largest and most destructive conflict in human history, and what Eisenhower did in that confrontation tells us something about him that no battle and no strategy ever quite captures. He refused to shake Jodl's hand. This is the story of why, and what it meant, and what it cost Eisenhower to do it, and why, in the long accounting of what the war was actually about, it may have been one of the most important things he ever did. Before we get into it, if this is your first time here, this channel is built around the real Eisenhower, the decisions that do not appear in textbooks, the moments that the official histories clean up or skip over entirely, the man behind the supreme commander. If that is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe now, hit the like button, turn on notifications so you never miss a video, and leave a comment below. We read every one of them. Now, back to Reims, back to Alfred Jodl, and back to what Eisenhower did when they brought him into the room. The protocol of military surrender, in most traditions, involves a degree of formality between the parties. Officers salute, hands are shaken, the defeated are treated with a certain professional courtesy that separates the act of surrender from the act of humiliation. This courtesy exists not out of sentimentality, but out of practicality. Armies that believe surrender means humiliation fight to the last man rather than give up. Armies that believe surrender means professional treatment within the laws of war are more likely to lay down their weapons without continuing to spend lives on a cause that is already lost. Eisenhower knew this. He was a professional soldier of 30 years. He understood the conventions and their purposes. He understood them, and he set them aside. When Jodl was brought before him, Eisenhower did not offer his hand. He stood, he looked at the German general, and he asked him, through an interpreter, a single question. He asked Jodl if he understood the terms of the surrender fully and if he was prepared to execute them and to ensure they were carried out. Jodl said that he was. Eisenhower told him that he would be held personally responsible for any violation of the surrender terms, and then he dismissed him. No handshake, no professional courtesy, no acknowledgement of the shared fraternity of military men that often exists, in a complicated way, between opponents who have fought each other with skill and determination. Nothing. Jodl was taken out of the room. The people who were present at this exchange described Eisenhower's demeanor in ways that are consistent across accounts. He was not theatrical, he was not emotional, he was not performing anger for an audience. He was cold in the specific way that a person is cold when they have made a deliberate decision about how to behave and are executing it without drama. The coldness was the point. To understand why Eisenhower made that choice, you have to understand what the preceding years had produced in him. Not the strategic picture, the human one. Eisenhower had spent the final weeks of the war in Europe doing something that most supreme commanders do not do. He had visited the concentration camps. In April 1945, as Allied forces advanced into Germany and began discovering what the Nazi regime had constructed in the industrial centers of its occupied territories, Eisenhower made a decision that was deliberate and considered, and in retrospect, historically significant in ways that go beyond the military campaign he was commanding. He went to see for himself. On the 12th of April 1945, Eisenhower visited the Ohrdruf concentration camp in Thuringia, Germany. Ohrdruf was a subcamp of Buchenwald. It was not the largest camp the Allies discovered. It was not the most notorious. It was simply the first major camp encountered by American forces, and Eisenhower was there within days of its liberation. What he saw at Ohrdruf has been described by those who were present, and by Eisenhower himself in letters written in the days immediately afterward, in terms that make clear it was unlike anything he had previously encountered in a military career that had already exposed him to the full range of what war produces. The bodies, the conditions, the evidence of systematic, industrialized, bureaucratically organized murder on a scale that exceeded what the language of military reporting was designed to describe. He walked through it, he looked at it, he insisted on looking at it. He did not rush. He did not allow the visit to be managed or shortened or filtered through what his staff thought the Supreme Commander ought to see. He walked the full circuit of what Ohrdruf contained. He brought with him General Omar Bradley and General George Patton. Patton, a man who had seen more combat than almost any other American general of the war, who had been hardened by years of violence and death, became physically ill at Ohrdruf. He refused to enter one of the buildings. He stood outside. Eisenhower went in. He later wrote, in a letter to General George Marshall, that he made himself look at everything because he anticipated that someday there would be people who would claim that what happened in those places had not happened, that the evidence would be disputed, that the reality would be denied. He wanted to be able to say, as a witness, that he had been there, that he had seen it with his own eyes, that it was real. He also did something else. Within hours of leaving Ohrdruf, he sent cables to Washington and London. He described what he had seen in language that was precise and deliberate, and stripped of the distance that official military communication usually maintains from the human reality of what it is describing. He ordered every American unit in the vicinity to come through the camp. Not to punish the soldiers, not as an exercise in horror, but because he believed that the men who had fought the war needed to understand what they had fought against, that the abstract language of the war's justifications, freedom, democracy, the defeat of fascism, needed to be grounded in the specific, concrete, irreducible reality of what the Nazi regime had done to human beings. He wanted them to know. He also contacted the press. He invited journalists and photographers and members of Congress and members of the British Parliament to come and see what was in those camps. He wanted the record to be made while the evidence was fresh and unambiguous and available to be witnessed by people whose credibility could not easily be dismissed. This was not a spontaneous reaction. It was a deliberate act of documentation by a man who was already thinking about the historical record and who understood, with a clarity that many of his contemporaries did not yet possess, that what had been done in those camps was going to require a reckoning that went beyond the military campaign. By the time Jodl sat across the table in Reims on the 7th of May, Eisenhower had been carrying Ohrdruf for 3 weeks. He had been carrying it alongside everything else, alongside the final operations of the campaign, alongside the diplomatic complexities of coordinating with the Soviet forces advancing from the east, alongside the political pressures from Washington and London about the terms and timing of the German surrender, alongside all of it. And then Jodl was brought into the room. Alfred Jodl was not an SS commander. He was not the architect of the extermination program. The specific mechanics of the camps were not his operational responsibility. The historical and legal record on this point is complex, as it is for many senior Wehrmacht officers who served the Nazi regime without being directly involved in its most extreme crimes. But Jodl was not innocent in any meaningful sense of the word. He had served Hitler loyally for years. He had been present in the highest councils of a regime that had constructed Ohrdruf and Buchenwald and Auschwitz and Treblinka and all the others. He had signed orders. He had been part of the machine. The Nuremberg Tribunal, which tried him after the war, found him guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced him to death. He was hanged in October 1946. In the room in Reims, in the early morning of the 7th of May, none of that had been formally established yet. The legal process was still ahead. The evidence was still being gathered. The tribunal had not yet been convened, but Eisenhower knew what he knew. He had walked through Ohrdruf. He had seen what the regime that Jodl had served had done. He had stood in the buildings and looked at the evidence and chosen not to look away, and then written to George Marshall about the need to document everything because someday people were going to try to say it had not happened. And now the representative of that regime was standing in front of him, asking to be treated with the professional courtesy that military tradition extended to defeated opponents. The handshake is a small thing. In any individual transaction, it is almost nothing. A brief physical contact between two people that acknowledges a shared humanity and a certain professional regard. In this specific moment, in this specific room, between these two specific men, it was not a small thing at all. To shake Jodl's hand would have been to extend to him the courtesy that the traditions of military professionalism prescribed. It would have been to treat the German surrender as a transaction between two military establishments that had fought each other honorably and were now concluding their conflict with the appropriate formalities. Eisenhower did not believe that was what had happened. He believed that the war in Europe had not been a conflict between two military establishments. It had been a conflict between two fundamentally different ideas about what human beings are and what may be done to them. On one side, the proposition that every human being possesses an inherent dignity that cannot be stripped from them by law or force or ideology. On the other side, the proposition that human beings can be categorized by race and that some categories can be marked for extermination. Ordroof was what the second proposition looked like when it was implemented by a modern industrial state with access to railroad networks and bureaucratic organization and the cooperation of enough ordinary men doing ordinary jobs. Eisenhower had walked through it. He knew what it looked like. To shake Jodl's hand was to suggest, however briefly and however symbolically, that the men on the two sides of the conflict had been engaged in something equivalent, that what separated them was the outcome rather than the nature of what they had been doing. Eisenhower refused to suggest that. Not because he was performing for an audience. There is no evidence that he calculated the public impact of the gesture or consulted with his staff about how it would be received. He simply did not extend his hand. He asked his question. He gave his warning. He dismissed the German general. The decision was made the way Eisenhower made most of his decisions, quickly, without drama, from a position of clarity about what he believed. He believed that some things should not be normalized, that the extension of ordinary courtesies to men who had served the machinery of mass murder was a form of normalization, that it implied an equivalence that did not exist and should not be implied. He chose not to imply it. The reaction to this moment, in the years after the war, has varied depending on who was doing the reacting. Military historians who emphasize the professional conventions of officer culture have sometimes characterized it as a breach of protocol. Scholars of the Holocaust and of Nazi crimes have generally viewed it as an appropriate and morally significant refusal. Eisenhower himself did not write extensively about it. He did not produce a justification or an explanation or a defense. The accounts of what happened come primarily from people who were present. His own statements on the matter were brief and not elaborated. He had done what he believed was right. He did not appear to feel that it required extensive defense. This is consistent with something that runs through Eisenhower's entire record as a commander. He made decisions, he executed them, he moved on. He did not perform his moral positions for audiences or construct elaborate justifications for choices that seemed to him to be obvious. The refusal to shake Jodl's hand was obvious to him. The man had served a regime that had built Ordroof. Eisenhower had seen Ordroof. There was nothing complicated about the calculation. What is worth examining is what the gesture cost him, because it did cost something. Not politically, in any immediate sense. The war was over. Eisenhower's position was secure. His reputation was, by any measure, at its peak. The refusal to shake a German general's hand was not going to damage his standing in any practical way. What it cost was something more internal. Eisenhower was a man who believed in the conventions of his profession. He was a soldier who had spent 30 years inside an institution that valued order, protocol, and the formal observance of established practices. He was not a man who found it easy or natural to break from convention. His entire career had been built on working within systems, on understanding the rules well enough to operate effectively inside them. The decision to refuse the handshake was a decision to break from that instinct, to place something above the conventions of military professionalism, to say, explicitly and publicly, that the man in front of him did not deserve the courtesy that the conventions prescribed. That kind of decision carries a cost in a culture that values convention. It announces something, it draws a line. It says that the person drawing the line believes the situation on his side of it is categorically different from the situation on the other side. Eisenhower drew that line. He drew it not because anyone required him to, not because the protocol demanded it, not because he had been instructed to make a point. He drew it because he had walked through Ordroof and he knew what was on the other side of the line, and he was not willing to pretend, even in the smallest and most ceremonial way, that it was equivalent to what was on his side. There is a photograph that exists from the Ordroof visit. Eisenhower is in it. He is standing in the camp, surrounded by other officers, looking at what the camp contained. His face in the photograph is difficult to read in the way that faces in historical photographs are often difficult to read. But people who were present described the expression. They described a man who was looking at what was in front of him and not looking away, and who had decided to continue looking until he had seen everything there was to see. That decision, to look, to witness, to insist on the reality of what was there, is connected to the decision in the room in Reims 3 weeks later. Both decisions were about refusing to normalize, refusing to let the machinery of bureaucratic or military convention smooth over what had actually happened, refusing to participate in the process by which extreme events are gradually absorbed into ordinary categories and treated as variations on familiar experiences rather than as ruptures with everything that ordinary categories were designed to describe. Eisenhower was not a philosopher. He was not an ethicist. He was a soldier and a commander and a man of his time, with all the limitations and prejudices that entails. He was not without flaws. He was not without his own blind spots and compromises and moments where principle gave way to expedience. But in those weeks between Ordroof and Reims, he did two things that required a clarity of moral vision that is not as common as it should be, even among people of genuine integrity. He insisted on seeing, and then he refused to pretend he had not seen. Alfred Jod left the room in Reims without a handshake. He was tried at Nuremberg. He was convicted. He was hanged. Eisenhower went back to work. There was still the administration of occupied Germany to manage, still the repatriation of millions of displaced persons, still the political negotiations about the shape of post-war Europe, still the enormous logistical challenge of demobilizing an army of millions of men and returning them to civilian life. He did all of it. He moved through it the way he moved through everything, systematically, without drama, with the patient organizational intelligence that had made him the man Marshall chose to command the most complex military operation in history. He came home in June 1945 to ticker-tape parades and crowds and the kind of reception that a nation gives to a man it has decided to make a symbol of what it went through and what it achieved. He accepted it. He gave the speeches. He shook the hands that were offered, not Jodl's hand. That one he had kept. The distinction between those two things, the hands he shook and the one he refused, is the distinction this story is about. It is about the difference between the courtesy that human beings owe each other as a general matter and the specific application of that courtesy to specific individuals in specific circumstances. It is about whether the conventions of professional life can be maintained without alteration in the face of events that reveal those conventions to be, in certain cases, morally inadequate. Eisenhower decided, in the room in Reims, that the convention was morally inadequate. He decided it quietly, without announcement, without speech. He simply did not extend his hand. In the long record of the war, it is not the largest decision he made. It did not change the outcome of anything. The surrender happened. The war ended. Jodl was tried and convicted regardless of whether Eisenhower shook his hand, but it was a true decision. It reflected something real about what Eisenhower believed and what he had seen and what he refused to pretend he had not seen. And in a war that had been fought, at its most fundamental level, over the question of whether some things are actually wrong and not merely inconvenient, that refusal meant something. It still does.